Hi there, I'm Yusuke. I work on the AEPs, and today we're gonna do a video about aep-cli, command line interface, or aep-cli for short. It's a functional command line interface for any aep-compliant API. Here's a little bit of a summary of what we're going to talk about. First, we'll discuss what AEP or aep-cli actually is, how to get started, and we'll go into a couple of the more interesting details around aep-cli, how we've done some work to make it work with APIs that are APE adjacent, some of the deeper design decisions and motivations for its design, and last but not least, how you can get involved. So first off, what is aep-cli? Here is the GitHub repository that you can go ahead and check out, aep-dev/aepcli. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to that repository now. And there's a little bit of a summary of what aep-cli is, but effectively it is a client that is able to consume OpenAPI definitions that are compliant with the aep.dev API design specification. And from there, it's able to extract and generate a meaningful command line interface around the resources that API exposes and some of the operations that it exposes as well. So for example, you'll see here, if we had a bookstore API, we can store some configuration around that API, and from there it'll extract the fact that bookstore API has the books resource, publishers resource, and so on, and it'll create these commands like create, update, delete that correspond with the methods exposed on that resource. It's really useful if you want to avoid dealing with the complexity of maintaining your own command line interface for your APIs. You can just do all of the work in your API or service, and aep-cli will be able to do the rest to generate a command line interface that's usable to your users. So let's get started. In the repository, there is this docs directory, so you can go here and go to the user guide to learn more. But starting off with the installation here, there's a couple different ways to do so. You can install it directly from the releases page. We have some binaries built out for common platforms, or alternatively, you can go ahead and install it with go install at the URL that you see there. For the sake of my demo in here, we're going to be in an editor that exposes, that's already cloned the aep-cli repository. I'm going to go ahead and go install that. So we have that available. So this video isn't intended to be a deep introduction into the AEP specification itself or what is required, but I think it's worth taking a few seconds to take a look at the actual schema so that people can understand what it really means to be AEP compliant or adhere to the specification. So you'll see here there's a lot of path inside of this OpenAPI specification for the example server that we're using, but fundamentally what it really is a bunch of these collections of resources. So you'll see that it's the resource plural like publishers here, followed by the resource singular like publisher, and then if it's a child resource like a book is a child of a publisher, you'll see that the next collection named books is immediately following that. Within there, you'll have operations like creating a book, which is a post against that publisher book endpoint where you'll pass in a body with the resource itself and the ID in the path or in the query parameter. And you'll also have things like being able to list all of the resources on all the books by doing a get against that same endpoint. For individual operations on a resource, you'll see that we include the book in that path, and we have things like a delete operation to delete it, a get to retrieve the individual resource, or a patch to create that. That is generally what's required, followed with this point where the resource request and response are fairly standard. So any resource that individually operates on a resource besides delete should return that resource, like create, update, and get as well. And list will actually return back a object that has an array of the resources under the result field. Besides that, there are additional things that are in a well-formed AEP specification, like these annotations called x-aep-resource that is attached to the schema that is for the resource. But as we'll talk about later, those are not strictly necessary to use aep-cli. So again, since the AEPs adhere to this standard structure around the ways that paths are outlined, around whether they return a resource or not, we can actually infer whether a particular path pertains to a standard method, figure out what resource it's operating on by looking at that schema, and we can iterate through each of those paths. I'm extracting additional information like figuring out and inferring that the resource singular is the name of the schema itself, and looking at other things like maybe, which field actually contains those list of results. So from that inference, we can actually expand to support a broad range of APIs. So after installing it, you can see that if you run aep-cli, you'll get just a little bit of a help explaining that the first argument that's required is either this path to an OpenAPI JSON or an alias. So we'll talk about aliases in a little bit, but by default, the first argument that you'd want to pass in is either an HTTP or some local file path to an OpenAPI JSON file. For the purposes of this demo, I have this service aepc started up with an OpenAPI definition exposed to describe it around resources that exposes. Like you'll see here, I have publisher. There's also a bookstore resource, and there's standard methods like create, update, delete, and lists associated with all of those as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is effectively pass in the JSON definition here. And what you'll see here is it effectively extracts those resources from the OpenAPI definition and creates individual command groups for each of those resources. So as I mentioned previously, there's this book edition, publisher available as well, and each of those are then dynamically converted into resource groups. If each one of those individual groups has its own APIs available to it, what aep-cli will do is it'll look at those paths that are available, see which operations are supported by the resource, and create commands that correspond with each one. So things like create, delete, get, list are all available here, and each of those are directly converted into the appropriate commands. So if I type book create, for example, you'll see here that it actually is able to look at the schema of the book resource and is able to convert each of those into arguments. So you'll see that you'll need, for example, the author, the edition as well. And what we'll do here is the book resource, if I recall correctly, requires a publisher. So we're going to go ahead and say the publisher is Standard House here. And we're going to say create a resource foo. And we're going to set some of these required flags like ISBN, price, and published. And what it'll do is it basically converts that into an HTTP request that sends against the API. And you'll see here that we've been able to perform the appropriate operation. Just to kind of show this example in its completeness, we can do things like get the resource. We could update it if we wanted to. Let's see here. Price is required in all contexts in this particular case. But we can change those values as well. And of course, we can delete the foo as well. And then we'll do a get to show you that the resource is no longer found. So it's able to look at these different resources and extract these resource groups. And I think for most users, that's a majority of the functionality that you kind of want. So it's very useful in giving you that. We talked a little bit about how maybe that HTTP path is not as nice as you'd like it to be. So in situations like those, we have the ability to basically set a config file with an API alias. So you'll see here in the config aep-cli config.toml file, relative to your home directory, we can specify these APIs this alias name here, which is bookstores. We specify a prefix or path to the bookstore API, maybe some values that we want to configure the CLI itself. So for example, it's common for a lot of APIs to have a prefix attached before you go into the resource path like /v2. You can strip those out with path prefix. You can override the server URL if you want to, and you can also set various headers to handle things like authentication. In fact, we provide a config that makes all that simple for you, this aepcli core config add, and you can pass all those arguments. And so you can ask your users to just download the aepcli and run this one-liner that you've configured. And at that point, your customers and users can start using the CLI. And so you'll see here that I've already done that work here. So I have this aepcli bookstore alias, and you'll see here that basically it just directly maps to that OpenAPI JSON that I was pulling in by hand previously. And so it makes things look a little bit nicer. I don't have to pass in that whole JSON file. And instead, what I can just say is bookstore. And you'll see there's these nice semantic standard examples that you can provide. So we've talked a lot about, I think, everything that we wanted to here. And so we'll dive into a little bit more of the specifics of aepcli. And so one of the things is, as I mentioned previously, we do require a couple things for an API to be compatible with aepcli. One of which is that it is compliant to the aep.dev design specification. And the other part is that it exposes an open API definition. But we recognize that it's sometimes difficult to achieve either or both of those. APIs are difficult to change. Open API schemas also require some changes in tooling to generate the open APIs. And so we've done some work to actually support various slight deviations that don't impact the behavior of the command line at all. So for those of you who are familiar with the AIPs, which are from Google, the aep-cli can also interface somewhat with AIPs as well, supporting minor deviations between the specification for AEPs, like the field name of the list of the results in the list API, and also a very common one, which is Pascal case versus aep.dev, which uses the kebab dash as a delimiter across the names for the various resources. And we found that this is quite powerful. It unlocks a couple really valuable use cases. One is if you're a gRPC user, the gRPC gateway only exposes OpenAPI/Swagger 2.0, and so we've added compatibility for that. And also, if you're AIP compliant, there's a wide swath of existing APIs for that as well. And so we've given this a shot with a couple APIs that are out there in the real world, and we found that actually the Roblox API works well here. They have a open API definition that's exposed, and we talk a little bit about that in the aepcli homepage here. We plan to add sort of more APIs as we figure out whether they support or are compliant with the specification enough or not. Just as a note, these are not official support from the various organizations, but nonetheless, the compliant, I think, that is there is quite valuable. So you can look at this command to go ahead and download the OpenAPI JSON for Roblox as well. And there's quite a few resources that are exposed there. And I've already done that work in my own aepcli configuration. And so you can take a look at that. There you go. And so you'll see I have that definition right there. And so I can go ahead and say aepcli Roblox. And so for those who are familiar with Roblox, right, it's a online video game with a bunch of sort of user-created worlds and various membership rules associated with them. So you'll see a lot of the resources that you might expect to see there, like the universe, the users, maybe the creator store, data store related things that are available there. And so if I wanted to, for example, get my own universe there, I've already passed in my my HTTP API key. You'll see a little bit of an information about some of the parts of the schema itself that are not compliant, but you'll see here this is my little universe there. If I wanted to basically try my own and figure out what is or isn't compatible, I can add this -- log level debug to my aepcli here, and sorry, I just realized I've started using the Go run version, but this is synonymous with aep-cli. I could replace this with aep-cli and get the get identical information here. But you'll see here it kind of prints out all this information that will give you a better sense of sort of what aep-cli is trying to do to parse the OpenAPI JSON and sort of what it does or doesn't support. So you'll see here currently the version of aep-cli that we've released doesn't support custom methods. That's changed in newer versions, but for the purposes of this, it kind of tells you, hey, we don't currently support custom methods, and so we're not going to be able to parse this particular operation. So I think part of the fun of aep-cli is that we can actually test this. If your API just happens to already be compliant with the AIP design specification, or you're starting to work with the AEPs, you can get a sense of sort of how compliant and how well it works in aep-cli. So that's the overall demo. I wanted to spend some time maybe diving a little bit deeper into some of the design decisions. And maybe just briefly, we'll take a quick pause and talk about, some of the more advanced use cases. So one of the nice things about the AEPs is that they provide stronger structure than just sort of REST. Here's a resource, here's the operations on the resource. It provides clear guidelines around how parent-child relationships should be modeled, how custom methods work, how pagination works. And aep-cli either takes advantage of them now or will in the future. And so, for example, you saw in the example from before, I passed in the publisher parent into the book resource there, that -- publisher. That's because we're able to infer the parent-child relationship between publisher and book, and from there we're able to generate a command line interface that allows you to express that parent-child relationship accordingly. And some of this functionality, as I mentioned previously, is planned or will be shortly released as well for things like custom methods. Some better user experiences like a live edit, where it'll basically open up the resource in an editor and then go ahead and write that back through a update API call. So as I mentioned, I wanted to talk a little bit about the design decisions around aep-cli. So one of the major parts is this idea of client-side dynamicism. And so I think many who typically generate command line interfaces are familiar with the pattern that will do some level of code generation and will distribute a binary, and you will basically consume that binary. If the API changes, you'll consume a new version of that command line interface as well. We intentionally took a choice to make everything based on client-side dynamicism instead. And that is based on a lot of experience, mine included, around the difficulty of updating binaries that you would download. So there are situations where directly tying the version of the command line interface to the schema makes it so that if you wanted to pick up some new feature that's in the command line interface, you aren't able to because maybe the schema has a backwards incompatible change, and so you have to do this large migration to support that backwards incompatible change first. And so the inability to kind of control those two in lockstep has been quite difficult. The other part is if you are consuming a code-generated command line, they tend to update sort of all of the resources exposed to that API in lockstep. And then again, that's where backwards incompatible changes or minor behavioral changes can really be a bottleneck or some friction. So for example, if you want to take advantage of a new feature in a resource foo, but you can't because effectively resource bar has a backwards incompatible change, and so you have to basically have all of your users upgrade their usage of resource bar before you can take just advantage of the new feature in foo. It results in this huge, potentially multi-month gridlock where you're not able to take advantage of new features. And so the nice thing about doing everything client-side is if you want to take advantage of a new feature, you are able to have that freedom. You can consume an OpenAPI definition. You can modify it to support the new field temporarily if you want to. Maybe you can split the API apart if you wanted to, so you can control and update that individual part that you need to use. And so I think long-term, this will avoid a lot of the friction that you'll see with consuming generated interfaces. The other part, of course, is the reduction in maintenance on the side of the producer. Right? So you don't have to make choices about the language to support, build new commands as they go along. deal with the distribution thereof. All of that is handled by basically having your service be AEP compliant and participate in that APE ecosystem. You're kind of delegating a lot of that work to the AEP open source project. So that's it. I wanted to always end these videos with a plug to get involved. And in this particular video, I definitely want to encourage people to actually just give aepcli a shot. All of the documentation should be there to just try it out. Feel free to file any issues and give feedback. We also could use help all across the AEP ecosystem. We're building aepcli, which is our protobuf open API generator from a resource model. We would love feedback on that. Improving our clients and validators, improving the API guidance itself, and we definitely have plenty of smaller improvements for people who just want to get started. And if you want to get engaged, please join us at our Slack channel. We're in the AEP Slack, in the CNCF Slack, so just search for CNCF Slack online and you'll join the AEP Slack channel from there. And there is a README, and we also have regular meetings as well. That's it. Thank you so much. In future videos, we'll talk about some of the other clients that we have built and how to use those. Thank you.